Hello, everybody, and welcome today to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Victor Hanson. Professor Hanson is someone who, as a child, I already read his articles, his books, and watched him on TV, doing interviews and listening to his wisdom. Professor Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. His focus is in classic history and military history. He's the author of hundreds of articles, book reviews, and newspaper editorials on Greek, agrarian, and military history, and essays on contemporary culture. He has written or edited 24 books. And as I said before, he's someone who has been very, very vocal in numerous issues in American society, and someone who I think we can all learn from. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Victor Hanson, it's really a great pleasure to talk to you. I've been following you since I was a child in Brooklyn, New York, and finally to speak to you, it's a great honor. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with something that I thought interesting. I remember reading your book, Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles and the Rise of Western Power, and which was also translated in Hebrew not too long ago, again by Shibolet. And one of the things that I thought about while rereading some of it was that when you see the protests now, the pro-Palestinian protests in America, maybe even pro-Hamas, and the burning of the statues and outside of Holocaust museums and synagogues, do you think that in a lot of ways the West and the cultural things that you found in the West to be the reason why the West was so successful are not there anymore?
Well, it was a characteristic of classical critiques of antiquity, the beginning of Western society, that the combination of free market economics and consensual government and emphasis on individual freedom gave the greatest degree of security, freedom, and prosperity, but it required certain, I don't know what the word would be, breaks or constraints. In other words, that people should not morally or ethically do what they're otherwise legally or economically empowered to do. And when you start to lose in the West, as has happened at various periods, religion, social constraint, shame, the transference of public shame to private guilt, for example, is another pathology. So yeah, I think that we're in a period where the West, as defined by former British Commonwealth, in some cases, Europe, United States, and westernized countries, they're all in a period of crisis. And it's not because they're impoverished or they're necessarily endangered. It's just that they don't have confidence in their society. They don't understand the sacrifices that prior generation made to give them their current bounty. And they're sort of the baby boomers started it, but it's multiplied since then.
Yeah. When you see the protests that we just spoke about, and I guess also maybe we can even go back to Black Lives Matter protests a few years ago, and even before that, but I think it started like just seeing the absolute, maybe even hatred of Western values by these people, by so many in the West. Do you think that Israel, as maybe being seen as a representative of the West, has to worry in terms of American support in the future, or maybe they're just small amount of people that just make a lot of noise?
No, I think I'm worried. There's three developments that Israelis should be worried about. The first is that we have very lax immigration laws under this administration and prior ones, and there are millions of people who want to come in the United States and they do not want to come in legally, or if they do come in legally, they do not want to assimilate, integrate, and accept the mainstream values. We're not as bad as Europe, but we have about 250,000 people from the Middle East that come from autocratic regimes. We have about $10 billion in Middle East Gulf money that endows programs that are anti-Western. In addition to that, because of the DEI admissions policies at our elite universities, we're down to 20 to 30% so-called white people. In other words, the demographic represents 67% of the population, but in the last 4 years after George Floyd, we went into what we would call repertory admissions, that other groups would be overrepresented to supposedly make up or compensate for past injustice. And the problem was we had to get rid of the SAT, ACT standardized test, and we're letting a lot of people in who would not be otherwise in. And how that affects Israel is the number of Jewish students is at an all-time low since the 1930s. And so on our campuses, to take this example, you have more Middle Eastern students, more money, more Gulf-fed scholarships, fewer Jewish students. And then, as you know, the American Jewish community of nearly 3 million people is increasingly each generation becoming secularized.
Right.
And they maybe in the abstract they identify as Jewish, but as you saw at the Academy Awards, they feel that they have a special lever or insight or advantage with the DEI industry by saying that I'm Jewish, but I'm anti-Israel, and therefore I'm one of you, and you shouldn't get angry. They're ashamed of being Jewish, and the way they don't want to say that, so they take it out on Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And you put all that together, and you don't have, very similar to the Greek lobby. We used to have a strong Greek lobby of immigrants that were very vocal about the unjust Turkish invasion of Cyprus, for example, and that the Jewish lobby is not nearly as powerful as it was, if I could use that term. And I've never seen the overt acts. 50% of all hate crimes in New York are directed at Jews. And the people who commit those crimes are not identified. But when you look at the FBI statistics, it's pretty clear that they are people in what I would call the diversity, equity, inclusion block, Blacks, Latinos, but especially Arab Americans. And we don't really do much about it. So you can spit on
Yeah.
a Jew, you can say he's smelly at a lecture, you can go to his house, you can go to his synagogue, and there's no deterrence, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And it's accelerating.
Victor, I just wanted to ask, what you talked about the DEI before I get to my next question. Why is it, do you think, that the Jews aren't on the scale of the DEI? So you have, like, if I remember correctly, the woke progressive has like a scale of minorities that are oppressed. You have a sort of like intersectional coalitions of all these different groups. And I've been speaking to a lot of progressive Jews from my old days in New York, and they're pretty shocked that they weren't on that scale, and they're very disappointed. So I guess my question is, why is it just regular old scale anti-Semitism that the Jews aren't on the DEI scale? Or is it some sort of built-in, maybe because the Jews are more successful financially and, you know, in academia and maybe in the arts or whatever, so that's why they're not taken into consideration, even though they are a minority?
Yeah, I think you touched on all of them. There's three reasons. One is, as you say, is anti-Semitism. The other is there's a resentment that because of the Holocaust, other DEI groups feel that this is not fair, that even though the Jews were very active in the civil rights movement, that the horrific 6 million dead gives them some kind of a special status that they resent. I don't want to be too cynical, but it seems that the DEI people only talk in the positive fashion about Jews when they're dead.
Yeah.
But they don't like people referencing their own victimhood. They feel they have a monopoly on victimhood, and the greatest victimhood, of course, is the Holocaust. And then there's Israel. Israel has metamorphosized from the underdog to a regional power, and what they don't understand is that they only look at Israel's power vis-a-vis Hamas and Hezbollah, but not in terms of the wider Middle East, where they're outnumbered by 500 million people. So all of that, and then of course there's the opportunism. If you say that the Israelis are an extension of white power or white privilege or settlers or colonialists, and they don't belong in the Middle East, all of that feeds into the narrative. And it's very funny how this goes on because we're having a debate in this country, as you know, about Ukraine
Yeah.
and Israel. And a lot of us want to give Ukraine the effort, the wherewithal to defend itself. But what's very funny is the left says no ceasefire in Ukraine. Can't do it. You got to, but you have Israel, you have to have ceasefire. Israel has to text and drop leaflets about collateral damage. When Zelensky orders a strike in Crimea, we don't worry about civilian casualties. We say, well, Russia is an aggressor. They started the war. They have to be defeated. But we don't say Hamas started the war and they have to be defeated. We say to Israel, you have to be proportionate. And we say to Ukraine, no one ever won a war by being proportionate. You have to be disproportionate. We say to Mr. Netanyahu, you have to have a coalition government with the opposition. We say to Mr. Zelensky, it's okay if you suspend elections, you suspend political parties, you suspend habeas corpus. And so it's just completely a disconnect. And the only thing I can think of is and then another thing very importantly is we say that the Gazans are separate from Hamas.
Yeah.
Hamas hijacked the Gaza. We say the Russians are as guilty as Putin. Part of that is in the popular culture, Russians are always the villains in Hollywood movies. They're tattooed, they have accents, and the Palestinians are always noble victims. Partly it is Israel has been if you look in the popular culture, Israel is demonized as much as Putin is, even though the situations are entirely different.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very strange time, and it's accelerating. That's why it's dangerous. It's not growing. This hostility toward Israel and Jews is not growing arithmetically, but rather geometrically. Each week, it's twice as bad as the week before.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I just want to mention, if you also noticed that last week Biden was being interviewed and he said that Netanyahu does not represent the Israeli people. He said basically, I have differences with Netanyahu, but the Israeli people, I'm going to defend them. And I thought it was very interesting because it's exactly the same language they used on Hamas, where they said the Palestinian people are noble people, but they're not Hamas. They're not. We need to make sure that no innocent people die because they're not Hamas. And then they use the exact same language the president now does when he talks about Israel. He says, even though Netanyahu has a coalition government now with the opposition, with Benny Gantz and 99% 99 Knesset members voted out of 120 against unilateral Palestinian state, etc. They still say for some reason they're still trying to put sort of weed the line, I guess, for their Jewish donors, maybe that there's a difference between we could be against Netanyahu, we could still be pro-Israel at the same time.
Yeah, well, he's wrong as he knows. He's deliberately misrepresenting the truth because, as you know, while Netanyahu is a controversial figure, his leadership in trying to destroy Hamas wins about 85% support of the Israeli people. And as we know, Hamas was elected one time, and it's very naive to think that they could hijack $100 billion and build 300 miles of tunnels and get sophisticated German boring equipment, excavation equipment, and putting them under hospitals, mosques, schools, and nobody would know it. And then, of course, when the word went out on October 7th that it was open season on Jewish civilians, especially the elderly and children, 500 or so went in and used their expertise in the kibbutzes to facilitate the murdering and the torture and brought back captives. There were reports that some of them got bounties for captives. And then when an Israeli was killed or there was video, the people spontaneously, as they did on 9/11, by the way, they spit at the corpses, they yelled and screamed. So there was not much difference. The only reason that Hamas before October 7th in some polls was losing popularity was not because they were corrupt. It was not because they hated Israel. It was because they were deemed feeble and unable to do anything. And now, once they did something, I think they've regained popularity. I don't know if that'll be sustained because the damage that Israel is doing to Hamas may, I hope, wake up some of the people and see that these were the wages of October
Yeah.
7th that they
Um,
cheered on.
yeah. But on that note, one of the things that we've been seeing is that it seems to me that the administration in the U.S. is trying to, through the war, and get a ceasefire, which will then lead to a new Palestinian government with members of Hamas, and then say, at least that's what, the pressure Israel into accepting the new Palestinian government, which will have in the end members of Hamas, and then say, okay, Hamas is not the governing body. Now the Palestinian Authority is, and we will basically put it, force Israel to accept the new situation, and then give Israel, dangle in front of it the Saudi deal. How should Israel respond? It seems like, every other day the CIA director is here, Blinken's here lecturing us about how we need to stop killing innocent people. The president's every other now in the State of the Union saying too many people are dying. Then he's putting red lines. We hear that he might, if we go into Rafah, put an embargo on weapons that they're selling to us. How is a small country like Israel surrounded by enemies? We have Hezbollah. We're going to have to do something about that. What do we do?
Well, everything you say is true, and you need at least 2 more months to destroy Hamas. And the administration's in an election year. They feel that Michigan and Pennsylvania are key states, and there's 250,000 Arab voters that they're afraid will. And they lost 2016 by 10,000 votes. 2020, they only won it by about 40,000 votes. So they're affected by that. They do not like Mr. Netanyahu. They are very sensitive about, here in the United States, they're very sensitive about anybody interfering in our elections. They always accuse the Russians of doing that. And yet they nakedly and blatantly interfere in your elections. And I don't know what advice to. Israel is so dependent on the United States expertise, especially with replacements, things like Patriot batteries and things. They have to transition more to a self-sufficiency in weapons produced. And that's hard to tell the Israelis that, because they spend such a huge amount on GDP on defense already. But they, as somebody who'd been to Israel recently the last few years, I saw that the astounding success of Israel compared to, say, 2003 when I was there, or the open market, the high rises, the affluence, the oil and gas, the distillation plants. It was, and when you talk to Israelis in and out of the government, it was almost as if they felt they were almost at the end of history, and that the sheer success and bounty and leisure they created, those shopping centers in Jerusalem, gosh, I mean, they were just, Haifa looked like San Francisco used to look like. And I think the result was, when you talk to Israelis, they say, well, we're bringing in 20,000 workers and we're paying them 3 times what they do in Gaza. And we're teaching them, we take them to the emergency room when there was a sense that the Hamas people would look at that success and see it in terms of emulating it rather than resenting it.
Yeah.
And that was very naive and dangerous. And I remember my wife and I came back and I said, I'm very, very worried about Israel, because they don't understand that they're a permanent garrison state and they cannot let down their guard one moment, because their success does not create magnanimity to be emulated by the Palestinians. It creates resentment, that they get angry because they could do exactly the same thing. They have the resources from Gulf money, but they won't do it, or they can't do it, and they're angry, and it's not going to end well. I didn't think it would end like October 7th, but that's part of the problem. And we've had a big switch here. When I was growing up, the Democratic Party was pro-Israel and the Republican Party was isolationist.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's just the opposite.
Yeah.
If I don't want to be partisan, but if, for all of the eccentricities and crudity of Donald Trump, his policies vis-a-vis Hamas's funding, the Houthis' designation, the Iran deal, how we looked at Hezbollah killing Soleimani, moving the embassy, the Golan Heights matter, you name it, the Abraham Accord, he was the strongest ally for all of his weird rhetoric. He was the strongest ally that Israel has ever had in America. And I'll just finish with, it's a little dangerous because there's a sense in the United States for the first time, despite all of these law cases against him that are politically inspired, that he may win, and even his opponents. And I think the administration knows that. And I think people in the administration who are primarily from the Obama administration, they feel that their time is running out, and if they're going to quote unquote solve the Middle East price crisis, they have to be more and more flagrant and adamant, and actually more crude in their expressions of leverage and power and dictating to the Israelis. So it's going to be very, very touch and go, I think, for Israel the next 4 or 5 months. If we cut off your arms, or if you do not destroy Hamas, they're going to look at it as the greatest victory that they've ever achieved. And then Hezbollah and the Houthis and other people will want to get in on the glory and start to accelerate. Everybody knows that who has any sense in the United States.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you also, as an historian, a military historian, about surprise attacks like we had on October 7. If you obviously know more than me on this issue, but I was reading about surprise attacks of smaller, even guerrilla groups or smaller countries, smaller armies on the bigger country besides them. And it looks like they mostly, at least it seems that the original, it usually a lot of times succeeds, even though the other countries seems to have, and we know here, at least in October 7, Israel had different, now we know, signs that that something is going to happen, that there's something happening on the other side. They didn't know exactly, they didn't know how big, but they knew something was happening. How historically do we look at surprise attacks by smaller countries or smaller armies, because Hamas is not a country, but how do you look at such instances, and historically, where does October 7 on the scale of success or failure?
Well, as you know, it's constitutional systems or consensual societies advertise that they're more peaceful and they don't fight one another. Whether that's true historically is debatable, but they do pose that way, and they find it very hard to preempt. So we knew what Japan was doing and what was going to happen. And we actually moved our fleet out to Pearl Harbor, which was kind of stupid because it was safe in San Diego and it was not protected in Pearl Harbor. And then we waited for that attack. As you know, on the Yom Kippur War in October of 73, Golda Meir's government knew within 24 hours what was going to happen.
Right.
And they felt partly under the pressure from Henry Kissinger and then Nixon, they could not preempt. There were some indications that Hamas they were very clever in using their different types of primitive communications that couldn't be intercepted, but they chose basically the 50th anniversary of that surprise attack to repeat it. And they had the same assumptions that Israel would not preempt, because the one time they had done it in 67, they had been severely criticized, and yet that was their greatest success. So they were counting on the fact that you would not preempt, just as you didn't in the Yom Kippur, just as we didn't in World War II. And when Western powers do preempt, as you did in 67, to prevent a surprise attack, or what we did with Saddam Hussein, they're severely criticized. And their statesmen just don't want to act. We heard that Soleimani was going to up attacks on more American installations, so Donald Trump preempted and took him out. But he was severely criticized for that, even though it was necessary to do that. So they picked. I think what they looked at was very eerie. I wrote an article in the New Criterion about the similarities. In 73, it was brilliant what the Arabs did, because they promulgated the myth that the Soviets had cut them off from all weapons and Sadat had kicked the Russians out. And then the Russians supplied them to the teeth with sophisticated anti-tank weapons, SAMs, that were actually better than some of the supplies we gave you. And so you were surprised for the first 4 or 5 days. And people said, well, they'll never get through the sand berm. They had already done a water cannon experiment. kind of like Hamas, they thought, well, we'll try the hang gliders. We know we can get through the wall, and we will preempt. But before we preempt, we're going to feign that we've been cut off. We don't have much support. We're peaceful. Hamas now has given up on trying to destroy Israel. Those signals were given by Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in the Jerusalem Post reading that members of the Israeli government said the Palestinian Authority is anemic. They're not genuine. They're not authentic. They have no authenticity with the people. Hamas is the real center of power among Palestinians, and now they've given up on trying to defeat us, and we can marginalize them by osmosis or something. And I thought that was kind of crazy.
Yeah. Um, Maybe also in terms of the urban, we have we have been hearing two different conflicting narratives. One is that Israel is killing so many civilians, and it's unbelievable. We have President Biden citing the Hamas ministry's health ministry statistics, which is always very interesting. And on the other hand, we have Israel saying, we're in urban warfare, which is we had the West Point. I forgot the general's name, saying that the casualty numbers in terms of the number of innocent civilians and as opposed to combatants is very, very low compared to other urban warfares in the past. How do you square the two? Or maybe we don't even need to square the two, because I'm pretty sure the statistic that Hamas is giving is not true. But how do you assess Israel's war 5 months in Gaza?
Well, I try to compare it with similar things when people have terrorists. You surely didn't do what the Russians did with Chechnya when they just surrounded it with a 155 millimeter cannon and leveled Grozny to the ground. No one said a word. I look at what we did in Iraq when we got rid of ISIS out of Mosul. It looked like a moonscape. I was embedded in Iraq in 2006 and 7, and I saw some places. The first siege of Fallujah came in 2005. I walked through Fallujah after the U.S. Marines, in very heroic, effective fashion, destroyed. They destroyed the Ba'athist and some of the ISIS people, and almost every house I saw had a hole about the size of, I don't know, half the wall was blown out. And I asked the Marine commanders, why does every house have a hole in the side? And he said, because they all go upstairs and we blow off the stairway, and then we just leave them upstairs. So what I'm getting at is what we did to Japan in World War II, or what we did to Stuttgart or Berlin, or what we did to Fallujah, or what we did to Mosul is pretty analogous with what parts of Gaza look like. And I think we underestimate, though, Hamas, both in Israel and here in the United States. When they did October 7th, they were trying to achieve such a degree of savagery that had been unprecedented. I mean, beheading, decapitating, mass rape, torturing, that they knew that they were going to get an inordinate response. And they wanted to put human shields throughout all of these places. So you were in an Orwellian situation in which they launched 7,000 rockets deliberately aimed at civilian areas with no warning, and yet you were going to be punished for dropping leaflets or texting because you were going to be effective and they were ineffective. You could not, and in the Western current mind, if you're ineffective, then that's good. And if you're effective, you're a victimizer. So what's happening, I think, was pre-envisioned by Hamas, and they wanted this. But that doesn't mean it didn't have to happen. It had to happen. And so the only thing Israel can do now is continue to answer charges, give the actual statistics. There's only about one. I mean, it's very unusual in military history to have one combatant death per one civilian death when the combatants are interspersed, I should say, with civilians. And it's shameful that we use Hamas. But then Joe Biden, if you remember what he said when the hospital came up, when Islamic Jihad hit the hospital, he not only quoted these bogus reports that the Israelis did, he was angry and he said we wouldn't have had this problem if they could shoot straight. And if you think of the logic of that statement, what he was basically saying, if Islamic Jihad had have just shot the rocket and killed Jews in Tel Aviv as intended, I wouldn't have had a diplomatic problem.
Yeah.
But they screwed up and they killed some of their own. And so that's where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Um, Maybe just to zoom out a little bit, the Biden administration, and if I'm not mistaken, also domestically, Biden's poll numbers started going down when the Afghanistan pullout was just totally botched. And just it seems to me that but when he came into office, he basically decided that he needs to, first of all, just go back on everything Trump did, everything Trump decided to do internally and externally. America needs to do the opposite under Joe Biden. And in the Middle East, that was basically to turn your back on Saudi Arabia because the left hated Saudi Arabia because of what happened with the Khashoggi. And if I'm not mistaken, that was his name. And also, obviously, Israel and put pressure on Israel and even be reluctant to continue with the Abraham Accords. And I think that was the first time we saw that translated into reality was with the Afghanistan pullout, the fact that he basically defended the way it was done. And I think, and tell me if you agree with me or not, that a lot of American allies, enemies saw what happened and felt maybe more emboldened. So like Hamas sees that America is turning its back on Saudi Arabia, which is talking with Israel, turning its back on Israel in a lot of ways. He refused to talk to Netanyahu during it took a lot of time till Netanyahu was invited. And then when he was invited, it was at the UN, not at the White House. We had the protests here in Israel over the judicial reform, and Netanyahu was criticized by the White House numerous times over what was happening. So how do you assess, first of all, why the Democrat Party under Biden has become so different than Democrats even under Bill Clinton not too long ago?
Well, to answer the first question, when Biden came in, he, in a Pavlovian fashion, said that Donald Trump is very unpopular because of January 6th, and he was 35%. And he had run not as what he did. He ran the Obamas, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, the so-called squad. They were running the show. And to understand what's happening, you have to go back to the 2020 primary when he was behind and he was not going to be nominated. And Bernie Sanders, by March, was ahead of him. And that frightened the Democratic establishment. So they got Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Julian Castro, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, almost Pete Buttigieg, they all dropped out. And he won the South Carolina and the Nevada. And then they just dropped out and said, he's going to be the nominee. And he was presented to the American people as old Joe Biden from Scranton, a moderate. And he was not going to be like Donald Trump, erratic. He was not going to be like the Obamas. He was an old-fashioned Clinton Democrat. But he was really made a Faustian bargain where he said to the Obamas and his handlers, okay, I'm not cognitively up to the job, but I will be your veneer. If you let me be president, I will put your agenda. And he went very radical. And part of that was the demonization of Trump. So two things happened very quickly. On the geostrategic level, the world looked at what he did to the border. 8 million people just walked across the United States border. They looked at what he did with Afghanistan. He said right before Afghanistan, he'd said that he wanted to celebrate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And that would have been on September 11th. He wanted out by then. He was going to have a big parade. He left $50 billion to terrorists. They sold it all over the world. Then he let a Chinese balloon go right across the United States. They couldn't give us any accurate information. He told Putin if he was going to hack American targets, that he should at least not hack hospitals. He said to the Ukrainians, I will react to a Russian invasion, depending on whether it's a minor or major invasion. That set off. He suspended $100 million of aid to Ukraine as soon as he came in, because he thought that would be seen as peaceful to Putin and he would stop mass. I could go on. But on the specific So he lost deterrence geostrategically. But specifically, he looked at the Middle East and he had people who were really, I don't think it's libelous to say that, but they were quasi treasonous. And that's people like Robert Malley. They were, and there were people in the Pentagon that had strong pro-Iranian. So we begged Iran to get into the Iran deal. We paid $1.2 billion per hostage. We don't care about the hostages that Hamas took. But when Iran took them, we gave them $1.2 billion each, six of them, five of them or six. And then I don't know why he did that. He took the terrorist designation off the Houthis. On that gas deal with Lebanon, he favored the Lebanese and by extension the Hezbollah over Israelis. And he demonized Saudi Arabia during the campaign. He said that Saudi Arabia was a rogue state. He was not going to talk to them. He collapsed the Abraham's Accord for 3 years. And I could go on, and he restored funding to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and the UN. So the people behind him, I have not decided myself whether they wanted to precipitate a crisis, because they're not stupid and they know that any time the United States ostensibly separates itself from Israel, then the radical Palestinians and radical Arab nations see that as weakness to be exploited against Israel. And maybe they knew that. I don't know. But it was obvious. A lot of us wrote columns week after week and said, if you continue to do this, this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Russia's going to invade. China's going to keep threatening Taiwan. South Korea is going to reawake and start sending missiles over Japan. And the Palestinians are going to start with Hezbollah attacking Israel. So it was as clear as day what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know how somebody could be so blinkered or ignorant not to understand the laws of deterrence and the nature of our enemies. But this administration, it really, you got to remember that.
Victor, I
right
have one
October
question
7,
about these issues, and then I want to ask you two, three more questions about internal stuff in the U.S. and vis-a-vis also Israel. But one of the things that it seems to me, after all you just said about Biden's actions and their consequences on America's enemies, and by extension, obviously Israel's enemies, and maybe all of the West's enemies, is that we have this basically the head of the octopus in Iran. Hamas is not an individual actor. They basically are funded, weapons, everything, Qatar and Iran, but Iran is one of their bigger backers. We have Hezbollah, which is obviously around the Houthis you mentioned, other different groups in Iraq, which are shooting missiles at us too, in Syria. And one of the things that I've been hearing in Israel by a number of people is that maybe we should just go straight for the head of the octopus. Maybe at the end of the day, when we're fighting with Hamas, Iran is actually winning because they're sitting there in Tehran. We're fighting and losing. The economy is contracting here. It's cost 200,000 Israelis are, refugees in their own country. America is fighting with Israel on the world stage. Everybody sees it. And Iran is sitting there. No one's basically doing anything about it. They're continuing. They're very close to developing enough nuclear material or to get to a nuclear bomb in the near future. What do you foresee that it will be inevitable that there will be some sort of war with Iran at some point in the near future?
Oh, I do, but I would partially object in the sense that this administration wants Israel to do that because for two reasons. They're not stupid. They understand that Iran threatens them as well, as they see if you look at the Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, they understand that Iran is an existential threat to international navigation, commerce, peace. And so they would like somebody else to do it, and then they would like to blame Israel as causing a Middle East conflagration and a theater war. So if I were the Israelis, I would destroy Hamas and see if they can hold off Hezbollah, and then I might deal with Hezbollah if they continue to make it impossible for Israel to live. And then I would hope I could hold out for 4 or 5 months if there's a new administration. And if there's a new administration, then one of two things would happen. If Israel felt that it was existentially threatened by Iran, in which it is, that administration would give it the wherewithal and the green light to go ahead and do what it takes. And if that seems not in Israel's interest, in Israel's eyes, then the United States might act as well. If Iran continues, you got to remember that when we killed Soleimani, the Iranian government called up the Trump government and said, "This is intolerable what you've done. And we have lost face and we have demonstrators. So we are going to send missiles back. However, we are telling you in advance that these missiles will not kill one American. We want you to stay in your facilities. We want the blast to be recorded." Some Americans reportedly got some trauma from their eardrums or whatever, but not one American was anywhere near death. And that was what they did. They were so terrified. Every time any Western power has stood up to the Iranians, they backed down.
Mm-hmm.
And they were told by the Trump administration reportedly that the Trump administration gave them a list of targets that encompassed everything from the grid to their ports. And these would be hit if they killed any more Americans, and they stopped.
Yeah. In 2019, I read your book at the time. It was called The Case for Trump. And I really enjoyed it. And I just want to say that maybe I want to ask you just, first of all, do you think the case for Trump grew stronger towards this election now? And number two, do you think that you mentioned before his rhetoric and the fact that, despite all his rhetoric, his policies were, let's say, better than for Israel and obviously, and his extension, probably for the US. Do you think that voters will be able to overlook what they didn't overlook in 2020?
Yeah, I think we know that to be true. Today there was a poll and it was a liberal poll that suggested 45% of Latino voters are going to vote for Trump as of now, and 20% of black voters. And because he's lost the so-called white vote by about 56%, goes to Trump, he can't win the election unless he gets at least 88, 89% of the black vote and about 60% of the Latino vote. And he's not getting that in the polls. And he's behind in 8 of the 9 swing states. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to win because, as you know, in 2020, we had the biggest revolution in history where 70% of the people did not vote on election day, and the authenticity rate of the ballots died by a magnitude. So you can't, and that's one of the strategies. So they have 3 strategies right now. And one of them is to change the voting laws, and they've done that. The second is to change the demography by getting 10 million people in, all of whom, believe me, will try to vote through mail-in balloting, they think. And then number 3 is, if that doesn't work, to use the court. So they tried to get him off the ballot. We've never done that in the history of the United States. The Supreme Court threw that out. And now they have 5 lawsuits. He spent $500 million in legal fees and penalties already, and it's estimated that even if he's acquitted, he'll spend $1 billion. And he was outspent last time, $3.5 billion to $1 billion. So he will spend more on legal fees than he did in the 2020 campaign on the election itself. So a lot of people, I think the general feeling is if it's a fair election, Donald Trump will have a landslide, but they're so cynical and pessimistic, they don't think he will be elected. They feel something's going to happen. There's always an October surprise. In 2016, they released the 10-year-old Access Hollywood tape where he was, and all of a sudden they said he was through. Of course, he did a great debate after that. And then in 2020, the CIA Mike Morrell cooked up this idea of 50 experts would swear that all of this incriminating information on the Hunter laptop was cooked up in Moscow, which was a complete lie. They knew it was a lie, but it had a great effect on the election. So we all know what is going to happen. But I'll just finish by saying I've never seen the left, and I grew up in a Democratic family. So I know them well. My family a lot of them are left. I've never seen people more paranoid or terrified that Trump is going to win. And especially because he appeals to minority voters as a strong leader, somebody who worries about the price of food, gasoline, the border, transgender, is all these issues that the left has adopted that are antithetical to their own base.
Right. And maybe on that point, why do you think they have adopted it? I'm just, I mean, in terms of like we hear about, you spoke about the Michigan voters that he's so scared that they're uncommitted, and that's why one of the big reasons why he's turning his back on Israel now. But at the end of the day, like you said, he's losing in the polls the base of the base. He's not losing in the polls because 100,000 crazies in Michigan who hate Israel and hate probably America are not voting for him because of his Gaza policy. He's losing because white working class people who used to be on the Democrat Party don't find him appealing. He's losing. If I read polls correctly, tell me if I'm wrong. He's losing because Hispanics are in a large portion, not like you said, and maybe some a more significant amount of black people, black men, if I'm not mistaken, more than ever are saying they're going to vote for Trump. So why is he going to the crazies instead of going to the middle?
Well, I think there's two reasons. You know yourself from the Israeli left,
Yeah,
hard left, that ideology for an ideologue, it's better to be correct ideologically than to compromise, even if you lose. And they never think they're going to lose. Even so, they do things that are not in their interest to be purist. So whether he wants to change or not, he can't. He's a captive of these people that are running him, and they're the most left-wing people that have been in power in the United States in the 1930s. They know the border has to be closed, and yet even at this late date, they can't close it. They know that crime is out of control, but they can't do it. Joe Biden could not even get the name right. He knows that he should have said Laken Riley was murdered. He called her the USC football coach, Lincoln Riley. And then he apologized for calling the murderer an illegal alien. He knows that that's wrong. But when the left said, how dare you? The left had no problem with an American nursing girl getting killed by a felon that was let in illegally. They had a big problem with the incorrect use illegal, which he is. And so that made no sense. He knows when he says to Netanyahu, you're going to have a come to Jesus moment or whatever it is.
yeah.
He knows that 84% of the American people support Israel over Hamas. And he also knows this, that when people protest in the Middle East, Jewish, pro-Israel, Jewish, just anybody, when they protest, they're lawful. They do not storm bridges. They do not face the Lincoln Memorial. They do not disrupt. They don't kill people. They don't chase people down in libraries. And they don't take over the rotunda, which they did. And January 6th, those guys went to jail for that. They know they don't. Last week we were 26 minutes late for the State of the Union address because of pro-Hamas demonstrators. That is much more catastrophic than a bunch of buffoons in the rotunda on January 6th. They didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So in his view, he thinks Jewish pro-Israel supporters are law-abiding. They're not going to be violent. They're not going to disrupt. And their donors are always going to give to us. They've always been democratic. They'll bitch and moan, but the Palestinians, you got to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
We have an open border. They might have some terrorists. These people might vote against us. We got to be careful. And that's how he reacts to it.
Yeah. And I think he's making just maybe piggyback on what you just. I think he's making a big mistake in terms of the electoral. It just seems to me that when you have, they always say in the primaries you go to your base, but then when you finish the primaries you should go tack to the center because that's where the independents are, the people who are not committed, and he's making a big mistake. That's just from Israel. I'm not gonna tell Joe Biden what to do internally, but it just seems very misguided politically.
But he knows that's a mistake, but he has a way of squaring that circle that you proposed. And the way that they're trying to square it is they are not talking about Israel to an American electorate. They're saying that Netanyahu is an aberration, that he has to be removed. If he was removed, all of our goodwill would go back to the Israelis because then they would do what we want. They would have a peace ceasefire. The hostages would come back. Hamas would be chastised and reformed, and the good Hamas people would come back. And they use this word now, as you probably picked up in the media, technocracy. They're going to have a technocracy. They're going to go. people in Qatar and people in Moscow have created a new government where it's not going to be political. It's just going to be Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Authority, and they're going to be technocrats. And that's what they want to do. And so they're waging really a war more against the Netanyahu government right now to get him out. And they feel, and you talk to them, and I talk to some of these people, that coalition government will break. It's too much of a temptation for the Israeli left. The enticements are so high. The very idea that the Americans will lavish them with aid and military, and they can say to the Israeli people, America likes us again. All we have to do is get rid of Netanyahu, and then maybe they're right that we can deal with Hamas, and that's what they're counting on.
Yeah, I would just say, and then I'll ask you a few very short questions before we finish. That today there was a poll by INSS, which is the Tel Aviv University's think tank on international studies and military issues, and the poll found that Israelis were much to the right than Netanyahu himself, meaning that if Joe Biden thinks that Israelis, once they get rid of Netanyahu, will be suddenly left wingers who support a Palestinian state, the support for a Palestinian state is the lowest it's been in decades right now, and the support for its finishing the job with Hamas is in the 90% range. So it's very weird. Maybe it's just a political tactic, like you said.
I think people in the United States that followed October 7th, and most did, were surprised that Hamas chose to target an area that was the most conciliatory to Hamas, the most in favor. And when you do that in a war, they really destroyed the left-wing credibility on a two-state solution.
Yeah.
And that was ironic because people in the kibbutzes had been the most willing to give concessions to Hamas.
Yeah.
And they repaid
and
that.
Also in terms exactly. And in terms of like workers and Gazans coming into work in the kibbutzim and all that kind of stuff, that was the big, all these kibbutzim had workers in the farms and in the agriculture that were from Gaza. And then the Gazans came in, and not even Hamas. They said there was 3 waves. The first wave was the more special forces of Hamas. The second wave was the more lower people, and the rest were the regular citizens. And the third wave that came in to steal stuff, kill people with their bare hands. Yesterday, I heard was unbelievable.
What I'm amazed at is that all of the media, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, NPR, MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, Silicon Valley, Google app, they're all pro-Hamas. So is entertainment, professional sports, corporations. But when you actually talk to people, I would say when I talk to people, I live in a farming community. Almost everybody is overwhelmingly for Israel, 84%. Yeah. They always say that Americans are very practical people. When they say ceasefire, they always say the same thing. There was a ceasefire. What are you talking about? Before October 7th, there was a ceasefire. They broke it.
Right.
What did they expect? You go and murder a bunch of people. What do you expect? What did Japan think they were going to do? What did Germany think they were going to do? What did Vietnam think they were going to do? What did ISIS think? We bombed the crap out of ISIS once they started beheading. What do they think was going to happen? So that's the attitude of the American people. And I think that message often doesn't come across because the left controls these institutions, and it shows you just how powerful the average person's feelings are to Israel, that they maintain them and they sustain them even against this barrage of propaganda.
Yeah.
But you go to certain states, I mean, the center of California, or you go to rural Oregon, even blue states, and just overwhelming the number of people who support Israel.
Yeah.
And I think it really embarrasses a lot of the Democratic pro-Israel politicians that, like somebody like a Chuck Schumer or an Adam Schiff, that the support, when they talk in very anemic terms about Israel, their own supporters don't like them, and they triangulate because of their own supporters, but their opponents are their natural constituents. And their opponents want them to be more pro-Israel, and that's what's very strange.
Yeah, And also in the polls, you see that as the older people get in America, the more they support Israel. So you have the 18 to
Yes.
24-year-olds who we spoke about in the beginning in the universities, and more Americans, I think, today are in colleges and universities than ever before. And I think that in itself is changing the way American society is built. And I guess my next question is a very weird question, maybe to you, but in Israel, we don't really know, I think most of us, what woke or progressivism really means. I mean, we live in a country here that's very family oriented. Even people in Tel Aviv, I'm right now sitting in Tel Aviv, you have even gay couples. The interesting thing about it is that everyone wants a child. In America, it's being single and not having children is accepted. Here, socially, it's not. You have a lot of very family, very religious. Even people who are secular do kiddush on Shabbat or go to synagogue on Yom Kippur and etc. In America now, you see the Poles very lot less affiliated in church. Like you spoke about before, you mentioned transgenderism and the whole, to say your pronouns before your name and everything. Here, it's not a thing at all. And when we look at what's happening in America, a lot of us, even young people, are like, what is going on? What, like, we don't really understand or comprehend what the younger generation in America, what do they think? How are they taught to? How are they spoken to? It seems so foreign to us.
Well, it started in the late 20th century, but especially in the new millennium. What happened is we mastered the global, it was really an Americanization of the economy. So we, from Seattle to La Jolla or San Diego, that strip was the window on China and Japan and South Korea. And when you look at where I live, I'm speaking right now from where I work in Stanford. Silicon Valley has $9 trillion of market capitalization. Google, Apple, Facebook, etc. So you see these kids at this campus that I'm on, and they have Mercedes Benz with BLM stickers on them. Or you see, and you look at Berkeley is on the strip, University of Washington, USC, UCLA, Stanford. Then you go to the East Coast, and it's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the corporations, Washington, D.C., New York, and they were the window on the EU. And what I'm getting at is we rewarded a particular type of American that had transnational skills, like the people in London, for example. And so you see these young people, they're in the media, they're in tech, they're in insurance, they're in law, and they're in academia. And all of a sudden their market became huge. I'm a I'm a historian, but also I'm a journalist. And 40 years ago, when I wrote a book, I could sell maybe 10,000 copies. And if I was lucky, I wrote a column, maybe five news. I never in my right mind believed that what I would write would turn up in South Korea or the Chinese would want to buy it. It's just a whole new market. And so what I'm saying is, but half the country were muscular and they were in assembly and manufacturing and mining and agriculture and construction. And if you look at their wages, they were frozen because jobs were outsourced or offshored. And out of that became a dogma that said the losers are the losers because they're stupid. And Joe Biden even said, they have to learn to code. And Hillary Clinton said, well, I'm going to shut down coal. And they convinced themselves that all of our strengths was that agriculture, and we were the largest oil and gas producer, and we were the most effective construct. All of that was something to be ashamed of. They were the postmodern. And so the culture grew up reflecting those economic realities. And we've got a pampered society that feels, you know what, I'm making so much money. Children are a bother. I don't want to judge anybody. I'm a citizen of the world. I travel. I know all the great restaurants in Paris. I don't know any in Indiana. I know all the best places to eat in Shanghai. I have no idea where Fresno is. So it's two countries. And because we have a federal system that allows people to move, we're having about 10 million people have fled what they call the blue states, California, Illinois, New York. They don't work and they're becoming more in debt, more poor. Their cities are, came back from San Francisco. I was in New York not too long ago, Chicago. they're not like they are. But if you go to Tennessee or you go to northern Georgia or you go to Florida, it's booming. I've never seen wealth like that and confidence, and people are marrying and they're buying homes. So it's almost like the Civil War. I hope it doesn't have the geographical factor, but and if you go to Wyoming or Utah, it's the same thing. Yet there's a sense of pessimism and anger, and it's just the up in the California coast. It's a beautiful place, but it's not working, and they know it. And I think it was a result of the asymmetrical effects of globalization, what it had on the culture, and then we had the Zoom culture, the tech culture, and George Floyd did the woke lockdown, and George Floyd created a whole nuttiness that I've never seen before. The quarantine was a disaster. So we've had a lot of shocks, and the question is, are we going to recover? And I think we're almost bottoming out, because in San Francisco, just 3 weeks ago, they passed ballot measures. These were all leftists. There is no Republican Party. Hiring more police, clamping down on looting. So the left agenda doesn't work. And I think a lot of people thought, well, I have the right zip code, I have the right degree after my name, it'll never affect me. It'll only affect the yokels. But it's affecting them now. Their kids are not getting into school. They have perfect SAT scores, and they're rejected on the basis of their race, and they're getting angry. So everything is in flux in the United States. So it's very hard to say, Americans. There is an attempted Jacobin French-like revolution that occurred in America to take over the government and the culture. And I think we're in the Thermidor reaction. I don't know if we're going to get a Napoleon. I hope not. But there is a reaction building against all this, and you can feel it. And that's why, as an outsider, you can see how they had a hearings with Mr. Robert Hur, the special counsel, the other day. And the left was just crazy. They were just yelling and screaming. And so they are paranoid that the show's over, I think. And they know they've lost the revolution, and they're afraid. They keep projecting onto Trump what they would do. They say if he's elected, he might weaponize the FBI or the CIA, or he's going after me. Robert De Niro said he's going to put me in prison. Well, that's what they would do if they had power, and they assume that Trump thinks like they do. But actually, Trump, for all of his crude talk, he's never been vindictive. Mm-hmm. He didn't do any of that.
Yeah. Victor, one last question before I let you go, because we're coming short. I wanted to ask you one question that I find very maybe concerning, to me at least. It seems as though the right in America has a sort of divide that's more and more evident, at least on social media, among, you might call them writers and journalists on the right, and even some academics, is that you have, for example, people who really, really support Israel, and it seems as though most of the Republican voters in polls do very much support Israel. And then you have people that just comes to mind, people that remember Tucker Carlson talking about October 7 in very weird terms, also about he went to interview Putin, and then after that he was in Qatar or Dubai, I don't remember where, and he said something to the effect that he feels he was basically criticizing Israel for what it's doing in Gaza and other. You have this sort of strain in the American right lately of non-interventionism, isolationism, that it seems is propping up more and more, at least among the thinking class of the right. And how do you see this divide? Do you think it's major, or it's gonna? How do you look at it?
Yeah, I see it as well, and I'm worried about it. The proper response to the Iraq and Afghanistan misadventures has been to be Jacksonian. No worse enemy, no better friend, so that when we do intervene, we do it in our interest, and we target it, and we don't go into a country and try to put pride flags on the embassy in Kabul. So it's a reaction to that that's an overreaction by some on the right. Part of it, vis-a-vis Israel, is some on the right were angry about the Iraq or Afghan war, and they're especially angry about the never Trumpers. So there was a prominent group of Jewish Americans, Bill Kristol, David Frum, and others, Elliot Cohen, a whole bunch of them, that I thought in a very arrogant way, but it had nothing to do with being Jewish. They just didn't like him. And they were very adamant. And so they broke with the Republican Party. And some of the people wrongly interpreted that as a Jewish American hatred of MAGA, that they were elitist. And that filtered over to Israel. It didn't affect, by the way, the common Judeo-Christian middle class. You're right, it was an elite. The other thing about Europe was they get so attacked about families and traditional values and nationalism. Then they looked at Viktor Orban, they look at Putin, and they say, well, he makes commercials making fun of woke, and they're trying to, the Orthodox Church, and they're trying to bring back family, and they're overlooking the authoritarian strain. So it's something to watch. It's not as dangerous as the loony left, but
right.
I think the center of the Republican Party is no longer Mitt Romney and John McCain, neoconservative interventionism and elite. It's not the golf course aristocratic party of the Bushes. It's a national populist, and it's won over the middle class. That's what's so strange. When I was growing up, Republicans were elitists, they were wealthy, but its strength is not the wealthy. They vote for the Democrats,
right.
And the poor do. The Republican Party is the party of the middle class, and Democrats are the subsidized poor and the wealthy. But there are elements in that. The neoconservative thing, they're gone. It's a MAGA middle class, but there are elements in that party that are extremist, and they think we're not going to get involved at all.
Mm-hmm.
Or we've got a bunch of elite Republican rhinos that traded on us, and they're all arrogant, and we don't like them. And sometimes it manifests itself. But when I argue with some of and I know these people very well, I like Tucker Carlson, I know him very well. And I know a lot of people, I go on Fox News 3 or 4 times, I know them very well. Some of them have reservations about Ukraine. I will say one thing, that when you talk to that group of isolationists or and you talk about Israel versus Ukraine, they're much more in favor of Israel than they are of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they always say the same thing. Ukraine is not yet a democracy. Israel is. We've been supporting Israel for years. And they feel that radical Islam is more dangerous than Russia. So if you talk to them, they say, why are we violating the Nixon-Kissinger rule that you never make China closer to Russia or Russia closer to China than to us? We should be triangulating with Putin in a realist fashion. But then when they talk about Israel, they will say, I hope they destroy Hamas. And I haven't found any of them to be overtly anti-Semitic. I think they're naive sometimes about the dangers we face. But just to conclude, again,
mm-hmm.
I'm always amazed that Israel is this little country with 10 million people. It's surrounded by 500 million people that have oil and wealth and geostrategic advantages. Yeah. And yet the United States people, not necessarily the government, but the people always side with Israel. And we only have, as you know, 3 million Jews in the United States.
Right.
And anti-Semitism is on the rise again, but yet it doesn't seem to matter that people they very much admire the Israelis. They admire them because they're independent, they're skillful, they're capable. And I think it's counterintuitive. I hope Israelis don't think, well, if we stop now, the Americans will really praise us. I think the Americans in the long term will say they took care of Hamas, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a mistake to listen to Biden. I know that poses risk for you, but you're going to have to find a way to navigate that. And all of us in the United States are trying as much as we can do in commentary on media to ensure this administration does not cut off any supplies to Israel. If it did, it would be a catastrophic blunder on their part politically.
Yeah, I agree.
But let's hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Victor Davis Hanson, I have to say that it was a pleasure talking to you. And when you're in Israel next time, you're more than invited for Shabbat dinner by us. So thank you
Okay.
so much. It was just, it was, I think it's important to talk to people like you, because in Israel, we don't get to hear, basically in our media, in the mainstream media, if you can call it that, on the big TV stations here and on radio, all you hear is the mainstream, maybe center left opinion about what's happening. And I think it's important for people to hear voices like yours, which are optimistic and also give us more of a understanding about what's happening in America, because not everyone is Joe Biden. Not everyone is
No,
Anthony Blinken, etc., etc. So I think it
no,
is
no.
important that we hear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The majority of Americans support Israel and want them to finish the job.
Thank you, Victor.